The story begins not with a gunshot or a whispered threat, but with a feeling, a slow burn rising from the alleys, backrooms and cigar-smoked parlors of a city learning to fear and admire the same man. New York in the early 20th century was a place where loyalty was currency, silence was safety, and a wrong word could rewrite the fate of an entire neighborhood. Into this world stepped a man who understood something the others didn't. Power wasn't merely about brutality. It wasn't about the body count, the territories or even the money. True power was the ability to make men stand beside you when the world gave them every reason to run. And that man was Charles Lucky Luciano. Every era produces a figure whose shadow stretches farther than their lifetime, whose decisions echo long after their empire collapses. Luciano was not simply a mob boss. He was the architect of a new order, a system that transformed scattered, violent street gangs into a disciplined, structured network capable of reshaping the American underworld. But he didn't build this world through fear alone. He built it through alliances, through trust, manipulation, strategy, and a brand of charisma that made enemies shake his hand and wish they were his friends. To understand how he forged those alliances, you have to understand the deeper truth. Luciano knew people. He understood their weaknesses, their ambitions, their hidden nightmares. He knew what every man wanted, and even more importantly what every man feared losing. Imagine a dimly lit room, the kind where the walls have heard more confessions than any church. A group of men sit around a table. Some of them Italian, some Jewish, some Irish, backgrounds that once meant rivalries, turf wars and bloodshed. But that night they sit together because one man convinced them that loyalty could be shared, that business could be bigger than pride. That man doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to pound the table. He simply leans forward and speaks calmly, explaining how unity can turn small-time hustlers into empire builders. In those moments, Luciano looks less like a criminal and more like a visionary CEO. The room listens. The underworld shifts. Yet behind this cool, strategic mind lies a different kind of story, one forged in poverty, in survival, in the unspoken rule that you protect the people who stand with you. Luciano had grown up in a world where betrayal could come from your closest friend and where loyalty could save your life. Those lessons didn't fade when he rose to power, they sharpened. They became the very blueprint of his approach. His alliances were never random. They were crafted, shaped, tested. He knew how to spot loyalty, how to build it, and how to enforce it with a smile that hid a warning. But loyalty in Luciano's world wasn't poetic. It was dangerous. It demanded sacrifice. It demanded silence. The men who pledged themselves to him understood the risks. They also understood the rewards: protection, opportunity, influence, and a sense of belonging in a world where most men were crushed by the system. Luciano didn't rule with fear. He ruled with an understanding of human psychology that bordered on instinctual. He gave people reasons to stay loyal, not just consequences for disobedience. As New York expanded, as bootlegging enriched entire neighborhoods, and as violence erupted across every major borough, Luciano became the quiet center of the storm. While others fought for turf, he fought for structure. While others saw enemies, he saw potential allies. His brilliance wasn't in avoiding conflict. It was in knowing which conflicts were worth fighting and which alliances were worth preserving. Every handshake he made tightened his grip on the city. Every secret meeting pulled another thread into his web. But this wasn't a simple rise to power. It was a transformation, of himself, of his closest friends, and of the entire criminal landscape of America. Luciano didn't just navigate a world of danger, he redefined it. The code of loyalty he crafted became the heart of a system that would outlive him, influencing generations of criminals who would never meet him but would operate by rules he created. And as much as that code united men, it also became the silent force that would eventually test them, break them, and reveal who truly understood the meaning of loyalty when everything was on the line. The opening chapter of Luciano's story is a journey into a world where trust is rare, betrayal is inevitable, and the only men who survive are the ones who understand the weight of an alliance. It is a world where a calm voice can be more dangerous than a loaded gun, and where one man's vision can turn crime into an institution. This is the beginning of that journey, the rise of a leader who believed loyalty was unbreakable, even as history would prove that nothing, not even loyalty, stays pure forever. Before Lucky Luciano ever carved his name into the foundations of American crime, New York's underworld was a battlefield without rules, rhythm, or reason. It was a restless place, loud, chaotic, and constantly shifting, where survival depended not on strategy but on sheer brutality. The city's criminal landscape in the early 1900s was a mosaic of ethnic street gangs, each fiercely protective of its turf and traditions. Italians fought Italians, Jews clashed with Irish crews, and every neighborhood had its own set of violent codes enforced by men who valued pride more than profit. Unity was impossible. Cooperation was unthinkable. And loyalty was merely a convenience, discarded the moment it stopped being useful. The Italian underworld, the one Luciano would eventually dominate, was particularly fractured. The early crime families, known as the Mustache Petes, were old-fashioned men who clung to Sicilian customs with unyielding stubbornness. They trusted only those born on Italian soil, rejected alliances with Jews or Irishmen, and believed that violence was solved with more violence. Their world was built on rituals, traditions, and outdated honor, but not on vision. They treated the American Mafia like an extension of the old country, never realizing that America demanded a new kind of criminal leadership. This rigid mindset allowed the streets to descend into endless feuds, vendettas, and assassinations that bled into the public eye and drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. Meanwhile, Prohibition created an entirely new kind of chaos. The moment alcohol became illegal, opportunity exploded. Every gang, no matter how small, scrambled for a piece of the lucrative bootlegging industry. Truck hijackings, turf disputes, and shootouts became nightly occurrences. Entire boroughs turned into battlegrounds where control of a single warehouse could spark a war involving dozens of men. There was money everywhere, but there was no order. Every faction fought separately, guarded jealously by leaders who refused to trust anyone outside their circle. While the streets grew richer, they also grew more dangerous, and the violence only intensified as the demand for liquor increased. The Jewish and Irish gangs were no different. The Irish dominated the docks, unions, and political corruption rings, often clashing with anyone who got too close to their territory. The Jewish gangs, sharper in business and quicker to adapt, ran gambling networks and protection rackets with ruthless precision. But even they lacked a unifying force. Competition replaced cooperation, and every success invited another crew to strike back. It was a world where power shifted weekly, where alliances lasted only as long as convenience demanded, and where a man could rise to infamy in one season and disappear into a gutter the next. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Corruption ran deep. Judges, police captains, and politicians were bought and sold like cheap whiskey. The city functioned under an unofficial agreement. Crime continued unless it caused too much noise. But the noise never stopped. Bombings, kidnappings, assassinations. The underworld was turning New York into what newspapers called an undeclared war zone. Ordinary citizens lived in fear of stray bullets and gang crossfires, while newspapers fed the growing public fascination with the violent, unpredictable world hidden beneath the city's glamour. Within the Italian community, the lack of organization was even more glaring. Bosses ruled their small territories with iron fists but refused to acknowledge the larger picture. Instead of uniting to control resources, they weakened each other through petty rivalries. A single insult could spark a months-long blood feud. Territories were drawn not by strategy but by tradition and ego. The Mustache Petes saw themselves as custodians of Sicilian honor, incapable of imagining a future where working with non-Italians could lead to greater power. Their pride kept them blind and their rigidity kept them vulnerable. Amid this disarray, younger gang members watched with growing frustration. They saw fortunes slipping through their fingers because their leaders were too stubborn to evolve. They saw alliances crumble for no reason other than pride. They saw opportunities wasted, men dying unnecessarily, and money being burned in wars nobody could win. Many of these younger criminals, ambitious, American-born or American-raised, understood that the old ways were choking the underworld. They dreamed of something new, a system where business came before blood, where cooperation replaced tradition, and where strategy mattered more than ethnicity. The streets themselves reflected this cultural clash. In the Lower East Side, immigrants from dozens of nationalities lived side by side, trading, arguing, fighting, and doing business together. Criminals from different backgrounds crossed paths daily. They understood each other's languages, habits, weaknesses, and strengths. The younger generation saw what the older bosses refused to see. Multi-ethnic cooperation wasn't just possible, it was profitable. But no one had yet emerged with the courage, intelligence, and ruthlessness to turn that chaotic insight into a functioning reality. By the time Luciano's name began circulating in whispers, New York's criminal world was on the brink of transformation but lacked a leader to ignite it. The environment was ripe for a visionary, someone who could look past old grudges, unite diverse gangs, and convert violence into business. The city was desperate for order, even if that order came from the shadows. A man who understood people, power, and opportunity could reshape everything. But that man had not yet stepped fully into the spotlight. This was the world before Lucky Luciano. Violent, fragmented, unstable, and ruled by aging men who refused to adapt. It was a world where survival depended on luck, and fortune favored those who were willing to abandon the past. It was a world waiting, unknowingly, for someone bold enough to tear down its traditions and rebuild the underworld from the ground up. Luciano would become that man, but the chaos that came before him explains why his rise would feel less like a rebellion and more like destiny. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the sun-bleached poverty of Lercara Fritti, Sicily, a place where hope was a luxury and survival was an inherited skill. His father worked long hours in sulfur mines, barely earning enough to keep food on the table. Even as a child, Luciano watched men bow to authority because they had no choice, watched families suffer quietly because the world offered them nothing else. That early exposure carved into him a deep understanding. No one would hand him a future. He would have to take it. When his family boarded the ship to America, they believed they were escaping hardship. But the Lower East Side of New York in the early 1900s was a different kind of battlefield. Tenement buildings pressed together like prison walls. Immigrant families squeezed into rooms barely big enough to sleep in. The streets smelled of sweat, coal smoke, and desperation. Children grew up faster than they should, and every corner offered a test: fight, submit, or be swallowed whole. For young Salvatore, America was not the land of opportunity, it was the land where he learned to sharpen his instincts. School offered him nothing. He spoke little English, was mocked for his accent, and saw quickly that his textbooks would not lead him anywhere he wanted to go. What mattered were the streets, the alliances, the threats, the currency of respect. By the age of 10 he was already hustling cigarettes, doing small favors for older boys, and learning the unspoken rule of the neighborhood. If you don't stand up for yourself, nobody else will. The first time he fought back against a bully, he realized something important. Violence wasn't just survival. It was language, and he was good at speaking it. But unlike many boys who grew up in the slums, Luciano didn't rely on brute force alone. He had a gift for reading people. He could tell who was bluffing, who was scared, who could be pressured, and who could be useful. Even before he became lucky, he understood that the smartest men always used brains before fists. It was this awareness that separated him from the countless nameless children who drifted in and out of street gangs. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to rise. His first real crew came together naturally, boys who shared the same streets, hunger, and frustrations. Among them were names that would later become legendary: Meyer Lansky, the brilliant Jewish strategist; Bugsy Siegel, volatile and fearless; Frank Costello, diplomatic and calculating. These friendships weren't born out of convenience. They were forged through conflict, loyalty, and the shared understanding that none of them fit into the narrow world their parents imagined. They were outsiders who saw the future differently. One of the most defining moments in Luciano's youth happened not in a fight, but in a refusal. When an Irish kid demanded protection money from him, a common racket in the neighborhood, Luciano not only refused but beat the boy down and took the fee for himself. That boldness earned him respect and attention. It also caught the eye of older, more established criminals who saw potential in the fearless teenager willing to defy ethnic boundaries. In a world where Italians stuck with Italians and Jews stuck with Jews, Luciano had already stepped outside tradition without even realizing it. The nickname Lucky didn't come from superstition. It came from survival, the way he managed to walk away from robberies, fights, police raids, and later an attempted kidnapping that nearly cost him his life. Some believed he had supernatural luck. Others understood the truth. Luciano survived because he knew when to take risks and when to disappear into the shadows. He wasn't lucky. He was smart. By his late teens, he was already earning more money than his father had made in a lifetime. He worked for small-time bootleggers, ran dice games, delivered heroin before most people even knew what it was, and built a solid reputation among local gangs. But what truly set him apart was his refusal to let prejudice dictate strategy. While the older bosses despised working with Jews and Irishmen, Luciano embraced it. To him, opportunity had no ethnicity. If someone could make money, control territory, or provide protection, they were valuable. And if they were valuable, they belonged in his circle. This mindset brought him closer to Meyer Lansky, a relationship that would shape the entire future of organized crime. While other kids bonded over fighting, Luciano and Lansky bonded over ambition. They shared ideas, calculated risks, and talked about a world where gangs functioned more like corporations than chaotic mobs. Their vision was far ahead of their time, a blueprint for the organized, disciplined, and profitable mafia Luciano would eventually build. But the path to power was not smooth. Street life demanded payment in blood. Luciano learned early that trust could turn into betrayal overnight. He saw friends arrested, rivals murdered, mentors vanish, and bosses fall to gunfire in brutal turf wars. The Lower East Side was both his classroom and his test site. Every day he learned something new about fear, loyalty, greed, and ambition. Every mistake became a lesson. Every victory became a stepping stone. His arrest record grew, but so did his influence. Even police officers began to recognize the young man who always seemed to be at the center of activity but rarely caught doing the crime himself. He knew how to operate in the gray areas, always involved, never exposed. While others bragged or acted recklessly, Luciano stayed quiet, observant, calculating. He wasn't interested in fame. He was building something much bigger. As Prohibition approached, reshaping the entire criminal economy, Luciano saw opportunity long before most gangsters realized what was coming. Bootlegging wasn't just another hustle, it was a revolution. And while older bosses hesitated, clinging to traditional operations, Luciano prepared to ride the wave that would make fortunes overnight. He positioned himself perfectly, connecting with the right people, earning the trust of influential figures, and ensuring he had a network ready to activate the moment alcohol became illegal. By the time he entered his 20s, he was no longer just another street kid. He had become a rising force, feared, respected, and impossible to ignore. His early years had given him the tools he needed: toughness, intelligence, loyalty, and a deep understanding of human nature. He had learned that empires are built not on strength alone, but on relationships. And soon, the chaotic world around him would give him the perfect opportunity to turn his instincts into power. The rise of Lucky Luciano wasn't sudden. It was shaped by poverty, violence, friendship, ambition, and the harsh education of New York's underworld. He didn't simply adapt to the streets, he mastered them. And long before his name became synonymous with the American Mafia, he had already begun to redefine what loyalty, strategy, and leadership meant in a world where survival was never guaranteed. He entered Prohibition not as a small-time hustler scrambling for scraps, but as a man with a vision forming quietly behind his sharp, unreadable eyes. While the older bosses hesitated, clinging to centuries-old traditions, Luciano saw a country on the edge of transformation. The moment the government banned alcohol, he recognized it for what it truly was: a national invitation for men like him to build empires in the shadows. Liquor had become gold, and the men willing to modernize, cooperate, and organize were about to rise above the chaos. Luciano was ready. He began working under Joe Masuria, known as Joe the Boss, a crude, old-school gangster who ruled through fear and superstition. Masuria saw Luciano as a talented young earner with the rare ability to negotiate deals with Irish and Jewish syndicates. But while Masuria valued his skills, he could never understand his methods. To Masuria, cooperation with outsiders was treason. To Luciano, it was innovation. He played the role of loyal soldier while quietly studying every mistake the older generation made, every blind spot they ignored, and every opportunity their stubbornness left untapped. Bootlegging required more than muscle. It required distribution routes, safe storage, trusted suppliers, bribed officials, and a network of enforcers who could keep product moving across boroughs without attracting federal attention. Luciano began assembling these components piece by piece. He reached out to Meyer Lansky for financial structure and logistics, Bugsy Siegel for enforcement and intimidation, and Frank Costello for political access. Each man brought a different strength, and together they operated less like a gang and more like a corporation. Their operations were efficient, disciplined, and shockingly profitable. As money poured in, Luciano expanded into narcotics, gambling, and prostitution, turning each racket into a structured business with accountability and leadership. He believed the mafia should operate like a company, not a tribe. He divided responsibilities, created internal systems of discipline, and insisted that money, not ego, should drive decisions. While other bosses were obsessing over territory and pride, Luciano and his circle were counting profits, analyzing risks, and preparing for long-term dominance. Massive shipments of Canadian whiskey flowed into New York through their networks. Politicians were paid off before they even knew they needed to be. Speakeasies operated like clockwork. Competitors who refused to cooperate were either absorbed or eliminated. Luciano's empire grew so efficiently that even law enforcement began mistaking his discipline for invisibility. He didn't flaunt power, he streamlined it. He didn't make unnecessary enemies, he made strategic allies. For every problem he found a solution. For every threat he created an opportunity. His success, however, drew attention, from rivals and from his own bosses. Joe Masuria demanded a larger cut, forcing Luciano into a tighter leash. But Luciano was no longer a street kid, he was a strategist. He saw that Masuria's old-fashioned stubbornness was limiting their potential. For decades, the Mafia had operated on personal loyalty and Sicilian codes. Luciano was ready to replace those codes with something far more powerful, an organized national structure with a commission, a hierarchy, and cross-ethnic alliances. But that vision could not exist while Masuria controlled the Italian underworld. At the same time, another old-world boss, Salvatore Maranzano, was preparing to challenge Masuria for control in what would become the Castellamarese War. Luciano understood that the conflict between these two aging, pride-driven leaders would tear the community apart, unless someone stepped in with a solution. While the old guard fought over tradition, Luciano began planning the future. He started forming quiet alliances with men on both sides, ensuring that no matter who won the war, he would be crucial to the outcome. During this period he built what would later be known as the Young Turks, a coalition of ambitious, forward-thinking mobsters who wanted to break free from the obsolete rules of the Sicilian bosses. They believed in cooperation with Jewish and Irish mobsters. They believed in national organization. They believed in profits over pride. Every man in this circle understood that Luciano was the one capable of turning their ideas into reality. As violence escalated in the streets, Luciano carefully positioned himself as a neutral mediator. He attended meetings, calmed tensions, and gained a reputation for fairness and intelligence. Behind the scenes, however, he was preparing for a coup, one that would eliminate both Masuria and Maranzano and clear the path for an entirely new criminal order. He wasn't driven by bloodlust, he was driven by strategy. Internal wars were bad for business. Killings attracted police, frightened investors, and damaged the networks he had patiently built. He wanted stability, not chaos. At the height of the conflict, while everyone else was picking sides, Luciano picked the future. He knew that the man who ended the war, not the man who survived it, would become the true leader of the American Mafia. His vision was simple yet revolutionary: a national syndicate where every family had representation, where disputes were settled through negotiation, and where ethnic cooperation increased profits for all. It was a concept so efficient, so logical, that it seemed almost impossible, but Luciano had already built the foundation through his personal alliances. In the final months before the turning point, Luciano became the quiet force behind the scenes, arranging meetings, securing neutrality pacts, orchestrating business deals, and ensuring that when the dust settled, he would be the only logical candidate to lead. As his empire expanded, so did his influence. Men who once dismissed him for being too young or too Americanized now realized he was the only one thinking beyond the next street battle. By the time the Castellamarese War reached its breaking point, Luciano had already constructed the blueprint for the modern mafia. The structure, the alliances, the business logic, it all existed in his mind long before it existed on paper. While the old bosses clung to outdated customs, Luciano built an empire that operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. The transformation was already underway. The gangs were becoming families. The rackets were becoming industries. The alliances were becoming institutions. And at the center of this revolution stood Lucky Luciano, a man who understood that power wasn't inherited, it was engineered. His rise was no accident. It was the product of strategy, intelligence, loyalty, and an unshakable understanding of human ambition. And soon, the entire underworld would discover just how far Luciano was willing to go to build the empire he envisioned, and how unstoppable he would become when he finally seized control. Luciano was not merely a man of action. He was a man of ideas, a strategist who viewed the chaotic underworld not as a collection of criminals, but as a complex system capable of efficiency, organization, and expansion. To him, crime was a business, and businesses require structure, planning, and an understanding of human nature. While his peers relied on brute force, intimidation, and traditional hierarchies, Luciano approached the mafia as a living organism, one that could be optimized, managed, and scaled. Every decision he made was calculated to increase profitability, reduce unnecessary risk, and solidify loyalty. He recognized that an empire built solely on fear was unstable. It could crumble when fear faltered or when ambitious men decided to challenge it. What he sought instead was a system that made men depend on him, not through terror alone, but through shared benefit and opportunity. From the earliest days of Prohibition, Luciano understood that diversification was key. Bootlegging alone could bring immense wealth, but it was also volatile, dependent on law enforcement, rival gangs, and the whims of the market. He began to expand into gambling not as a chaotic side business, but as a controlled enterprise with rules, boundaries, and reliable operators. Casinos, illegal lotteries, and high-stakes card games were all part of his growing portfolio. Each venture was meticulously organized. Profits were tracked. Operations were monitored. Responsibility was delegated to men whose skills matched their tasks, ensuring that the organization functioned smoothly even when Luciano was absent. Unlike his predecessors, he built management systems that treated criminals not as soldiers, but as employees with incentives and penalties designed to maximize efficiency. Narcotics and prostitution were also integrated into his network with the same business-like approach. Luciano understood that these industries were highly profitable but fraught with risk. To manage these ventures, he relied on a combination of trusted lieutenants, careful planning, and layered protection. Every shipment, every operation, every transaction was designed to minimize exposure while maximizing gain. While others were content to operate small, risky rackets, Luciano scaled operations to a level that attracted significant profit without attracting immediate attention from law enforcement. The careful balance between visibility and secrecy became one of his greatest skills, allowing him to grow steadily while rivals faltered under exposure. Crucially, Luciano's genius lay not just in operational management, but in relationship management. He recognized that loyalty was a currency, sometimes more valuable than money itself. He rewarded competence and ambition, understanding that a man who felt respected and empowered would work harder, remain loyal longer, and act decisively when needed. Conversely, disloyalty was punished swiftly and efficiently, but always strategically, often in ways that reinforced the psychological lesson without provoking unnecessary backlash. This mastery of human psychology allowed Luciano to maintain authority without constant displays of brute force, making his empire feel simultaneously fair, structured, and unbreakable. The partnerships he cultivated were equally important to his strategy. Luciano forged alliances across ethnic and organizational lines, bringing Jewish, Irish, and Italian gangs into a cooperative framework that had previously been inconceivable. He identified key influencers within each group, building trust through mutual benefit and respect for their ambitions. These alliances were not based on friendship alone. They were calculated moves in a larger chess game, where each relationship could be leveraged to expand influence, prevent conflict, or secure access to new revenue streams. Luciano's understanding of loyalty extended beyond his inner circle. He created a network where the incentive to cooperate outweighed the desire to compete, subtly engineering stability out of a previously unstable world. Beyond alliances and operations, Luciano emphasized long-term vision over short-term gain. While the older bosses fought petty wars over territory and honor, he was building an infrastructure capable of surviving leadership changes, law enforcement pressure, and generational shifts. His foresight allowed him to anticipate government crackdowns, rival expansions, and internal betrayal, turning potential crises into opportunities. Each decision was made with a broader perspective, considering how today's move could shape the criminal landscape decades into the future. This forward-thinking approach distinguished him from his contemporaries and laid the groundwork for the modern American Mafia. Moreover, Luciano understood the importance of perception. Public image, even in the criminal world, mattered. He cultivated an aura of controlled power, calm confidence, and strategic vision. Unlike volatile leaders who drew unwanted attention through reckless violence, Luciano's presence commanded respect. Men followed him not because of fear alone, but because they recognized intelligence and discipline as traits worth emulating. This perception became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Loyalty grew stronger because men believed in his capability, and his capability grew stronger because loyal men surrounded him with skill and influence. Luciano's business acumen extended to politics and law enforcement as well. He understood that bribes, alliances with politicians, and manipulation of local authorities were not secondary concerns. They were integral to the operation. By investing in these relationships, he secured protection, gained insider information, and ensured smoother operations. To Luciano, corruption was not a moral compromise, it was a strategic tool. It reduced risk, expanded opportunity, and integrated his enterprise into the very fabric of the city's power structure. Ultimately, what distinguished Luciano from all others was his ability to combine operational mastery with psychological insight. He did not simply organize crime. He orchestrated loyalty, trust, fear, and ambition into a cohesive, functioning system. He was a visionary who treated the underworld like a corporation, an economist, and a psychologist rolled into one. Every alliance, every business move, and every enforcement action served the dual purpose of expanding profit and reinforcing control. He created a self-sustaining ecosystem where men became indispensable to one another, ensuring that his empire could survive both internal betrayal and external pressure. Through this approach, Luciano transformed the perception of organized crime itself. It was no longer a collection of violent, fragmented gangs operating by instinct. It became a disciplined network of calculated risks, structured hierarchies, and psychological strategies. He elevated crime to a science, applying logic, foresight, and strategic planning to an environment traditionally dominated by emotion, tradition, and impulsive brutality. The empire he was building was not just about money or territory, it was about creating a system that could endure, adapt, and thrive long after he was gone. In the end, the brilliance of Luciano's strategy lay in its simplicity. Treat men as assets, structure operations like a business, leverage alliances intelligently, and always plan for the long term. By the time he consolidated power fully, his empire was unmatched, not because he was the strongest or the most violent, but because he understood the rules of loyalty, human behavior, and organizational strategy better than anyone else. This combination of intellect, discipline, and psychological mastery would define the golden age of the American Mafia and cement Luciano's place as one of history's most formidable criminal architects. The era of the Mustache Petes was ending whether they realized it or not. These older bosses, traditionalists steeped in Sicilian codes, bound by honor, bloodlines, and a rigid interpretation of omerta, had ruled the Italian underworld for decades. To them, respect was demonstrated through violence, loyalty was assumed based on birthright, and outsiders were to be mistrusted or outright rejected. They refused to cooperate with non-Italian gangs, clung stubbornly to petty rivalries, and resisted the modernization that the booming economy of prohibition demanded. Their empire was crumbling, but their pride blinded them to the fact that the streets were evolving faster than they could adapt. Violence and territorial disputes continued to rage unchecked, and while they obsessed over tradition, younger men were already thinking about a new order. Luciano saw this rigidity not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The cracks in their leadership became most apparent during the Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. These men, representing the old guard, were locked in a deadly struggle over dominance, unwilling to consider compromise or modern strategies. Every assassination, every act of revenge, was a testament to their stubbornness. They could see no value in cross-ethnic alliances, no utility in cooperation, no potential in innovation. They were focused solely on proving who was the most feared, not the most effective. While they squandered resources on pride-driven vendettas, Luciano observed, calculated, and positioned himself to exploit their weaknesses. Luciano's frustration with the Mustache Petes was not merely ideological, it was pragmatic. Their way of operating created inefficiency, wasted resources, and increased vulnerability. Wars over minor slights attracted law enforcement attention, disrupted profitable operations, and drove away ambitious young talent who sought stability and opportunity. The old bosses were clinging to customs that made them predictable targets and limited their long-term growth. Luciano recognized that survival and expansion required more than fear and tradition. It required intelligence, alliances, and strategic foresight. The turning point came when Luciano began consolidating a network of like-minded young mobsters, later referred to as the Young Turks. These men were ambitious, adaptable, and willing to challenge the rigid hierarchy that had long dictated the underworld. They shared Luciano's vision of a business-oriented mafia, one that embraced cross-ethnic cooperation, measured risk, and profit-driven strategies. Unlike the Mustache Petes, they valued brains over brawn, strategy over pride, and loyalty based on mutual benefit rather than ancestral ties. Luciano became their natural leader, the bridge between old-school authority and a future built on innovation and ambition. Luciano's approach to dismantling the old guard was meticulous. He didn't rush into open confrontation. He studied every move, mapped alliances, and identified the vulnerabilities of Masuria and Maranzano. He cultivated relationships with key players on both sides of the conflict, building trust while secretly planning their eventual removal. His methods were strategic rather than impulsive. He understood that brute force alone could topple a man, but intelligence and timing could dismantle a system. In doing so, he turned the war into a chessboard, with himself as the player controlling the pieces from behind the scenes. Part of his strategy relied on exploiting the limitations of the old bosses. Masuria, for instance, was intensely conservative, stubborn, and obsessed with maintaining Sicilian traditions. He dismissed the capabilities of younger American-born or American-raised gangsters, underestimating both their intelligence and their ambition. Maranzano, though cunning, was equally trapped in the old ways, believing that absolute power required loyalty rooted in fear and bloodlines alone. Luciano recognized that their rigidity was a liability. He didn't need to fight them openly. He simply needed to position himself as the indispensable bridge between tradition and the emerging modern criminal world. While the Mustache Petes waged war for dominance, Luciano quietly strengthened his own influence. He secured strategic alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters who had previously been marginalized or dismissed by Italian bosses. He built networks of supply, protection, and enforcement that crossed ethnic lines, an approach that the old guard considered taboo. By the time violence escalated to its peak, Luciano had created a coalition capable of outmaneuvering both Mesuria and Maranzano, not through sheer force, but through intelligence, coordination, and strategic loyalty. The dismantling of the Mustache Petes was not merely a physical struggle, it was an ideological war. Luciano's rise signaled a shift in the very nature of organized crime. The old ways of rigid honor codes, ethnic isolation, and impulsive violence were giving way to a system that prized calculation, efficiency, and collaboration. Every action he took, every alliance formed, every rival observed, every operation streamlined, undermined the traditionalists while reinforcing his vision of a new mafia. The war became less about territory and more about the battle for the future of organized crime itself. This strategic patience allowed Luciano to emerge from the chaos not just victorious, but dominant. While the old bosses had relied on fear and brutality, he had leveraged relationships, psychology, and timing. He orchestrated events so that the downfall of his rivals appeared inevitable, yet he had done it without exposing himself unnecessarily. Mesuria and Maranzano, representing centuries-old traditions, fell one by one, and with each removal Luciano demonstrated that true power lay not in heritage, but in vision and execution. By the end of this period the Italian underworld was transformed. The chaos left by the old guard provided Luciano the perfect environment to implement his ideas on a larger scale. The streets were still dangerous, but now there was an emerging order. One where alliances, business acumen, and strategic thinking mattered more than pride and blind adherence to tradition. The foundation for the modern mafia had been laid, and Luciano stood at its center, not as a conqueror motivated by vengeance, but as a visionary who had turned inefficiency and division into opportunity. In the dismantling of the Mustache Petes, Luciano demonstrated a key lesson that would define his leadership. Power was strongest when it was strategic, organized, and forward-looking. Violence was a tool, not a philosophy. Loyalty was earned, not inherited. And the future of the mafia would belong not to those who clung to the past, but to those who understood the value of alliances, foresight, and calculated risk. This victory over the old guard was more than a triumph in a street war. It was the birth of a new era, one in which Luciano's vision would reshape organized crime forever. The creation of the Commission marked the most revolutionary transformation in the history of organized crime in America, and at the center of this seismic shift stood Lucky Luciano. Up until that point, the Italian underworld had been a chaotic patchwork of families, each controlling their own territories, operating under outdated Sicilian traditions, and governed by rivalries that too often erupted into bloodshed. The Castellammarese War had demonstrated the destructive consequences of this disunity, months of violence, killings, and instability that had destabilized even the most profitable operations. Luciano understood that the future of organized crime required more than brute force or fear. It required structure, diplomacy, and a system that could balance power among the various factions. The Commission was his answer, a governing body designed not only to resolve disputes but to institutionalize loyalty and cooperation in a way the mafia had never known. The idea was radical. Instead of one man attempting to dominate all families, the top leaders of each family would share power and mediate conflicts through collective decision-making. This approach minimized internal wars, reduced unnecessary exposure to law enforcement, and created a framework in which organized crime could thrive long-term. Luciano's genius lay not only in conceiving this system but in engineering it with precise understanding of human psychology. He knew that pride, ambition, and fear drove mobsters just as much as money did. The Commission had to appeal to these motivations while simultaneously providing incentives for collaboration and consequences for disobedience. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required authority without overt tyranny, influence without constant coercion. To assemble the Commission, Luciano reached out to his key allies, men he had nurtured, tested, and trusted over years of shared ventures. Figures like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and other forward-thinking mobsters became indispensable to the creation of this new governing body. But it wasn't just about loyalty, It was about competence, vision, and temperament. Each member was chosen for their ability to think strategically, navigate politics, and negotiate under pressure. Luciano understood that a strong structure demanded strong minds at its core, men capable of acting rationally even when emotion and tradition threatened to dictate action. These were not impulsive enforcers, they were architects of a new criminal order. The commission also represented a philosophical shift. Traditionally, the mafia had operated on personal loyalty and intimidation, often demanding unquestioning obedience. But Luciano's approach reframed loyalty as a contractual obligation reinforced by mutual benefit. Members were bound together not merely by fear of reprisal, but by the recognition that cooperation could generate wealth, security, and stability for all. This subtle recalibration of the rules created a psychological environment in which loyalty became rational rather than purely emotional, giving the commission unprecedented stability. Men followed Luciano not only because of his vision but because it made sense to do so, a combination of reason and respect that proved more durable than threats of violence alone. In practical terms, the commission functioned as a regulatory body. Territorial disputes, disputes over rackets, and disagreements over policy were no longer settled through constant assassination attempts or bloody feuds. Instead, leaders would meet, discuss, and reach a consensus that maintained balance while protecting profit. Luciano implemented a voting system, ensuring that no single man could dominate the others unchecked, yet everyone's voice carried weight. This prevented the concentration of power that had caused instability under Masuria and Maranzano. In effect, Luciano had created a constitutional framework for the underworld, an unprecedented fusion of criminal enterprise and governance. The psychological genius of the commission extended beyond its formal rules. By giving each family a stake in collective decision-making, Luciano turned potential rivals into partners. Ambition, a driving force in the lives of every mobster, was now channeled into productive avenues. Instead of risking their lives and fortunes in senseless power struggles, ambitious men could gain influence and wealth by negotiating, compromising, and executing operations efficiently. Fear remained a tool, but it was calibrated, reserved for instances where loyalty was tested, not wielded indiscriminately. In other words, Luciano transformed the culture of organized crime from reactive violence into strategic, systemic cooperation. The creation of the commission also allowed Luciano to expand his influence beyond New York. With a structured network, he could coordinate with families in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and other key cities, establishing a national framework that linked territories and operations. This was an innovation that the old guard had never imagined. No longer were families isolated and vulnerable to opportunistic attacks. They were part of a larger system with shared rules, responsibilities, and protections. Luciano's vision had turned the mafia into a corporation with governance, oversight, and cross-regional coordination, a level of sophistication unparalleled in any criminal enterprise of the era. Yet the establishment of the commission was not without risk. It required negotiating with men who had long histories of animosity, suspicion, and personal ambition. Missteps could have led to assassination attempts or rebellions. Luciano's ability to navigate these dynamics relied on a combination of charm, strategic concessions, and a deep understanding of the psychological triggers of each leader. He knew when to assert authority and when to allow a rival to maintain face, ensuring that no member felt entirely subordinated. The commission worked because it was as much a product of psychology as it was of formal rules. It created a perception of fairness, opportunity, and mutual respect that encouraged men to abide by its decisions voluntarily. The symbolic power of the commission was equally significant. It represented the dawn of a new mafia, one that transcended the old Sicilian codes, one that embraced efficiency, pragmatism, and cross-ethnic cooperation. It was a bold statement. Violence alone would no longer define the underworld. Strategy, structure, and vision would. Luciano positioned himself as the guiding force behind this transformation, but he was careful to appear as a facilitator rather than an autocrat. In doing so, he consolidated influence without creating enemies unnecessarily, a subtlety that would define his approach for the rest of his career. Through the commission, Luciano also institutionalized a long-term philosophy. Organized crime could survive law enforcement, generational change, and internal conflict if it operated as a system rather than a collection of individuals. This principle would prove essential as the FBI and federal authorities began to focus more attention on organized crime. By embedding rules, alliances, and shared incentives into the very structure of the mafia, Luciano ensured that his vision would endure even in his absence. Loyalty became not just personal but institutional, binding men to an order that transcended fleeting whims and egos. The creation of the commission was the culmination of Luciano's strategic brilliance. It was the apex of his understanding of human behavior, organizational management, and criminal economics. He had transformed the mafia from a disorganized, violent collection of gangs into a disciplined, cooperative network capable of long-term profit and stability. And perhaps most importantly, he had rewritten the rules of loyalty, creating a system in which men were motivated to follow not because they feared death, but because they understood that survival, success, and influence were inseparable from cooperation. In establishing the commission, Luciano did not merely seize power. He redefined the very concept of power in the underworld, leaving a legacy that would endure long after his own time. The underworld that Lucky Luciano built was not immune to conflict, and in many ways, it was the very pressures of his own success that created the most dangerous threats. While his vision of organized, cooperative crime reduced the frequency of open warfare, it did not eliminate it entirely. Rivalries, jealousies, and the ambitions of men who felt sidelined by the rise of the commission continued to simmer beneath the surface. Even the most disciplined organizations cannot fully suppress human ambition and fear. The hidden war, one fought in shadows through manipulation, subtle threats, and calculated violence, was as much a psychological battlefield as it was a physical one. Luciano understood that the greatest danger often came not from obvious enemies, but from those closest to him, from the men who were part of his inner circle but might one day see their own interests outweigh loyalty. During this period, the mafia faced constant scrutiny from law enforcement and federal agencies that had grown more sophisticated and aggressive. The Prohibition era had brought immense wealth, but it also brought public attention, investigative reporting, and political pressure. Federal agents increasingly coordinated with local authorities to crack down on bootlegging, gambling, and narcotics operations. For Luciano, this meant that the risks of every business decision were higher, and the margin for error smaller. His genius lay in understanding not just his allies and enemies, but the system itself, how law enforcement thought, how politicians could be manipulated, and how public attention could be deflected. Every operation was now a test of foresight, security, and subtle control. Internal threats were just as pressing. Even among those who supported him, Luciano had to manage ambitions carefully. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were loyal, but they were also strong-willed, intelligent men with their own desires for influence and profit. Managing them required a combination of incentive, subtle authority, and psychological insight. Luciano was constantly aware that a single misstep, a perceived slight, an overlooked opportunity, or a failure to reward loyalty, could fracture the very structure he had built. The hidden war was not only about protecting the empire from outsiders, it was about maintaining cohesion within, ensuring that every member of the network understood their place, their obligations, and the benefits of cooperation. Rival families, too, posed persistent challenges. Although the commission created a framework for dispute resolution, old grudges and opportunistic attacks were inevitable. Some families, resistant to the new order, sought to undermine Luciano's influence, testing the strength of alliances he had carefully constructed. Others attempted to exploit gaps in the system to expand their own power at his expense. In response, Luciano employed a combination of negotiation, strategic concessions, and, when necessary, decisive violence. Unlike the chaotic feuds of the past, these actions were never impulsive. They were calculated, deliberate moves designed to maintain equilibrium, demonstrate authority, and reinforce loyalty without destabilizing the broader network. The hidden war extended beyond the immediate circle of gangsters into politics and business. Luciano understood that the underworld could not operate in isolation. It was intertwined with unions, businesses, and political structures. Strikes, union disputes, and local elections became arenas for influence, leverage, and intimidation. Controlling these elements required a subtle touch, bribery, persuasion, and sometimes coercion, but always with the goal of strengthening his position and ensuring that rivals could not gain an advantage through external manipulation. The war in this sense was omnipresent, in the streets, the backrooms, the docks, and the corridors of power. One of the most remarkable aspects of Luciano's hidden war was his ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. He studied the patterns of rival behavior, the ambitions of his own lieutenants, and the pressures of law enforcement. By understanding the motivations and psychology of every player, he could preempt attacks, mitigate betrayal, and exploit weaknesses with precision. This foresight was not mere luck. It was the product of decades of observation, experience, and a deep understanding of human nature. Men feared and respected him because they recognized his ability to see the moves before they were made, to anticipate the consequences and to act decisively. Violence, when it occurred, was surgical and symbolic. Luciano avoided unnecessary bloodshed that could attract public or legal attention. Instead, acts of retribution or intimidation were carefully chosen to reinforce the hierarchy, maintain loyalty, and communicate warnings without destabilizing the broader order. Each act was calculated to achieve multiple objectives. It neutralized a threat, strengthened alliances, and sent a message that loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished. This approach demonstrated a profound understanding of the psychological dynamics of fear and respect, how violence could be wielded not merely as punishment, but as a tool of influence and control. At the same time, Luciano had to contend with the constant threat of betrayal from those outside his immediate circle. Competitors, disgruntled former allies, and ambitious outsiders were always testing the limits of his influence. Each interaction, each negotiation required careful calculation. Trust was never absolute, and every alliance had to be reinforced through both incentives and the implicit understanding that disloyalty carried severe consequences. The hidden war was not a series of isolated incidents. It was an ongoing, intricate struggle for dominance, stability, and survival fought in the minds and hearts of everyone within his orbit. The psychological dimension of this hidden war cannot be overstated. Luciano understood that men acted based on a combination of fear, ambition, greed, and loyalty. By leveraging these motivations, he could manipulate outcomes without resorting to constant physical confrontation. A well-timed threat, a strategic alliance, or even the simple demonstration of composure under pressure could achieve what brute force never could. He became a master of influence, crafting an environment in which men acted predictably, yet remained committed to the network, reducing instability and risk. Ultimately, the hidden war demonstrated the delicate balance of power that Luciano maintained. His empire was vast, profitable, and influential, but it required constant vigilance. The battles he fought were often invisible to the public eye, waged in whispers, deals, and quiet confrontations rather than open gunfights. Every day was a negotiation of trust, every decision a test of foresight. By mastering this hidden war, Luciano ensured not only the survival of his empire but its continued expansion, establishing a level of control, stability, and influence unprecedented in the history of organized crime. The brilliance of this period was that it showcased Luciano's true genius, the ability to wield power with subtlety, foresight, and psychological acuity, maintaining dominance in an environment where chaos and ambition could erupt at any moment. The streets may have been violent, but the battles that truly defined his reign were fought behind the scenes, in a war of minds, alliances, and unbreakable strategy, a hidden war that solidified his position as the master of the American underworld. The beginning of Luciano's downfall was as much a product of circumstance as it was of his own choices. By the mid-1930s, his empire had expanded beyond the city streets of New York into a sprawling network of bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, and union rackets that touched virtually every major urban center on the East Coast. He had built unprecedented influence not only over the underworld but also into legitimate business, political spheres, and even law enforcement circles. Yet, the very scale of this empire created vulnerabilities that even Luciano's foresight could not fully mitigate. As his power grew, so did the attention from authorities, rival factions, and ambitious men who sought to exploit any weakness. The higher he climbed, the more perilous every decision became. One of the first cracks in his carefully constructed empire appeared in the form of law enforcement investigations. Prohibition had ended, but the federal government's focus on organized crime intensified, with a new emphasis on uncovering links between illicit enterprises, corruption, and public officials. While Luciano had long operated with discretion and strategic alliances with politicians and police, the rapid expansion of his operations created more points of exposure. Investigators began connecting the dots, slowly but surely mapping out the sophisticated networks he had built. This scrutiny brought tension to his inner circle. Men who were used to the rewards of loyalty now feared the risks of association. Even the most disciplined operators were vulnerable, and the threat of arrest or betrayal was ever present. Rivalries within the underworld further complicated matters. Although the commission had brought a measure of order, ambition and jealousy never fully disappeared. Some members began to chafe at Luciano's dominance, questioning his decisions or quietly pushing their own agendas. These simmering resentments required careful management. Unlike earlier conflicts which could be resolved with violence or intimidation, the stakes were higher. Each rival was connected to intricate operations, making rash retaliation potentially disastrous for the empire as a whole. Luciano had to navigate these internal threats with tact, subtlety, and psychological insight. A misstep could trigger betrayal or fracture the network he had painstakingly built. Even among his closest allies, cracks began to appear. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were still loyal, but their ambition and desire for influence meant that power dynamics were constantly shifting. Luciano had to continually assert authority while respecting the intelligence and independence of these men. Balancing the aspirations of his lieutenants with the operational stability of the empire required constant attention. Trust, which had once been sufficient to bind his network, now needed reinforcement through calculated incentives and careful negotiation. The hidden war he had managed so well in previous years was becoming more complex, with every alliance carrying new risks. A critical turning point came when Luciano himself was implicated in criminal activity that could not be easily mitigated through political influence or bribery. Investigators had amassed evidence of his involvement in prostitution rings, illegal gambling, and narcotics distribution, and the growing media attention made public perception a critical factor. Unlike street-level crimes, which could be managed quietly, these allegations threatened to expose the entire structure of his operations. The risk of conviction was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, tangible, and potentially devastating. For the first time, Luciano faced a situation in which even his brilliance, connections, and strategic foresight might not be enough to preserve his empire or his freedom. Simultaneously, betrayal within his ranks became increasingly dangerous. Men who had once followed him unquestioningly now faced the pressures of legal scrutiny, personal ambition, and shifting loyalties. Some informants, eager to reduce their own sentences or secure favor with authorities, began to leak information about operations. Others, embittered by perceived slights or ambitious for their own positions, subtly undermined decisions or failed to act in his best interests. Luciano's survival now depended not only on legal strategy but also on his ability to maintain cohesion, suppress dissent, and anticipate the ambitions of men who had once been loyal. The combination of legal pressure, internal rivalries, and the constant threat of betrayal created a precarious environment. Every move Luciano made had consequences that reverberated across the empire. Even the most minor miscalculation, a delayed payment, a missed meeting, or an overextension of resources, could trigger a cascade of failures. He had built an empire on the principles of organization, foresight, and loyalty, yet these same principles now made him a target. A man whose influence was so centralized that removing or compromising him could destabilize the entire network. The empire that had once seemed invincible was suddenly vulnerable. Despite these mounting pressures, Luciano did not panic. He relied on the very skills that had made him successful: calculation, foresight, and psychological manipulation. He attempted to negotiate with law enforcement, influence judicial outcomes, and consolidate his loyalists to shore up defenses. Yet the environment had changed. The government was more determined, investigative techniques more sophisticated, and internal dissent more insidious. The strategies that had previously ensured his survival were no longer guarantees. The risk of a fall, long considered a theoretical possibility, had become a near certainty. At the same time, the moral dimensions of his empire began to weigh subtly on the operation. Men within his network were exposed to arrest, imprisonment, and violent retaliation. Allies were caught in dangerous legal and ethical limbos, and the consequences of their actions reflected back on Luciano as the architect of the enterprise. The interconnectedness that had once provided security now amplified risk, making every betrayal, error, or oversight potentially catastrophic. Survival depended not only on managing external threats but on controlling internal behavior, maintaining discipline, and anticipating every human factor that could undermine the system. The arrest that marked the beginning of his downfall was swift and decisive. Law enforcement, emboldened by public outrage and investigative breakthroughs, targeted Luciano's most vulnerable connections, ultimately linking him directly to criminal enterprises that could no longer be plausibly denied or ignored. Despite his reputation for foresight, the convergence of legal pressure, internal betrayal, and rival envy proved too great to evade. The man who had survived countless street wars, negotiated with multiple criminal factions, and built a national criminal empire now faced the reality that even a genius strategist could be caught in a web of his own making. This moment marked the transition from dominance to vulnerability. Luciano, the master of orchestration, the architect of a criminal empire that had once seemed untouchable, now confronted the fragility inherent in all human endeavors, even those built on intelligence, discipline, and loyalty. His arrest was not merely a personal failure. It was a signal that the very systems he had created to maintain order, loyalty, and efficiency could also be exploited to bring him down. The fall had begun, subtle, inexorable, and fraught with consequences that would ripple throughout the underworld he had so carefully engineered. The beginning of Luciano's fall was therefore not the result of a single act of violence or betrayal, but the convergence of multiple forces: law enforcement pressure, internal rivalries, ambitious lieutenants, and the structural vulnerabilities of his empire itself. It was a lesson in the paradox of power. The greater the control, the more consequential each weakness, and the higher the stakes when fortune, loyalty, and human ambition collide. For Luciano, the empire he had built with intelligence and foresight now presented its own set of perils, and the world was about to see that even the most calculated men are not immune to the inexorable forces of consequence. The trial of Lucky Luciano was a spectacle unlike anything the American criminal underworld had ever seen. By the mid-1930s, Luciano was no longer just a street boss. He was a national figure whose influence permeated politics, business, law enforcement, and every corner of organized crime. His arrest had captured the public imagination, and newspapers across the country treated the case as both a sensational scandal and a moral crusade. The government presented him as the embodiment of corruption, vice, and organized criminal power, while his defenders, to the extent they could publicly advocate, attempted to portray him as a pragmatic businessman, a man misunderstood, and a product of circumstance. The courtroom became a theater of ambition, power, and psychological warfare, where every word, gesture, and strategy carried immense weight. The trial was not just about proving guilt, it was about dismantling an empire and sending a message to every criminal enterprise operating in the country. From the opening moments, it was clear that this would be a high-stakes confrontation. The prosecution meticulously laid out Luciano's involvement in prostitution, gambling, and narcotics, presenting a network of witnesses, informants, and financial records that traced operations from the streets of New York to distant cities. Every testimony aimed not only to implicate Luciano but to expose the sophisticated infrastructure he had painstakingly built. The evidence highlighted not only his criminal acts but the organizational genius behind them, a genius that the authorities now sought to weaponize against him. Public attention was immense, with journalists, photographers, and spectators treating the trial as a drama that blended the intrigue of high finance with the lurid fascination of crime. Luciano's defense team faced the impossible task of navigating a court that was already predisposed against him. The government portrayed him as the puppet master of vice, a man whose decisions rippled through the lives of thousands, exploiting human weakness for personal gain. The defense attempted to mitigate these claims, emphasizing the indirect nature of Luciano's involvement and arguing that he had been misrepresented as the sole architect of the underworld. But the weight of evidence, combined with the media's portrayal, made these arguments difficult to sustain. Every connection, every ledger entry, and every witness added pressure, turning the trial into a carefully choreographed battle of perception versus reality. The courtroom drama was intensified by the personalities involved. Prosecutors were aggressive, relentless, and eager to demonstrate the power of the law over organized crime. Witnesses were nervous, intimidated, or unreliable, yet each contributed to the narrative that Luciano was at the helm of a sprawling criminal empire. Defense lawyers were forced to employ every strategy, from procedural challenges to character witnesses, to protect their client. Luciano himself maintained an outward calm, the expression of a man accustomed to controlling events around him, yet the stakes could not have been higher. Each day of testimony, each cross-examination, was a reminder that even the most disciplined and strategic individual could be brought low by the combined forces of law, media, and public scrutiny. Perhaps the most psychologically significant element of the trial was its exposure of betrayal and shifting loyalties. Men who had once followed Luciano unquestioningly were now under intense legal pressure. Some testified against associates to save themselves, while others remained silent, navigating a precarious line between loyalty and survival. The very network that had secured Luciano's rise, alliances, friends, and confidants, became a source of vulnerability. The trial highlighted the fragile nature of trust in a world where law enforcement, ambition, and self-preservation intersect. Luciano's ability to anticipate and manipulate loyalty had sustained him in business and war, but the courtroom presented a new kind of battlefield, one in which persuasion, credibility, and moral framing were as decisive as bullets and intimidation once had been. The media frenzy surrounding the trial amplified every aspect of the drama. Newspapers sensationalized testimony, reported on every detail of Luciano's lifestyle, and portrayed him alternately as a mastermind, a menace, or a fascinating enigma. Public perception played a critical role, as prosecutors leveraged moral outrage to strengthen their case, while the defense struggled to counteract the narrative being shaped outside the courtroom. The spectacle of the trial elevated Luciano from a criminal figure to a symbol, a representation of the broader struggle between law, order, and the organized underworld. The courtroom became more than a site of justice. It became a stage on which the morality of the entire nation seemed to be debated. Throughout the proceedings, it became clear that the trial was as much about deterrence as it was about justice. Authorities sought not only to convict Luciano but to send a clear message to the criminal world. No one, no matter how powerful or intelligent, was beyond the reach of the law. The prosecution emphasized the societal consequences of organized crime, portraying Luciano as a threat to social order, economic stability, and the moral fabric of the country. By doing so, they hoped to legitimize their aggressive pursuit and to encourage other members of the underworld to reconsider their allegiances and behaviors. As the trial progressed, tension and stakes escalated. Evidence was dissected, witnesses were cross-examined, and the courtroom became a chessboard on which legal, moral, and psychological strategies were deployed with precision. The weight of each decision, whether it was a choice of a line of questioning, a procedural objection, or a calculated public statement, carried enormous consequences. Luciano's reputation, freedom, and the very future of his empire hung in the balance. The trial was a crucible, testing not only his legal defense but the resilience, loyalty, and structure of the criminal network he had spent years constructing. Ultimately, the trial's conclusion reflected both the power of the state and the vulnerabilities inherent in any human enterprise. Luciano's conviction was a blow not only to him personally but to the empire he had built. It demonstrated the limits of influence, strategy, and loyalty when confronted with coordinated legal action, media scrutiny, and public moral outrage. At the same time, the trial exposed the sophistication and resilience of his network, which, despite his incarceration, retained the structures, alliances, and operational capacity he had instilled. It was a turning point, a moment in which the empire he had carefully engineered confronted the full force of law and consequence, and where the interplay of ambition, loyalty, and human frailty became painfully apparent. The trial of Lucky Luciano was, therefore, more than a legal proceeding. It was a defining episode in the history of organized crime. It revealed the complex interplay between strategy, loyalty, ambition, and morality. It underscored the limits of personal genius when confronted with systemic pressure. And it marked the beginning of the end of Luciano's unchallenged dominance, as the empire he had built faced both external prosecution and the internal recalibration that inevitably follows a leader's removal. It was a moment that would reverberate through the underworld for decades, influencing the operations, strategies, and psychological calculus of organized crime long after the gavel fell. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence remained extraordinary. His imprisonment, while designed to neutralize him, only revealed the extent to which he had constructed an empire that did not depend solely on his physical presence. From his cell, he continued to direct operations, manage alliances, and influence decisions, demonstrating a level of control that blurred the line between freedom and incarceration. The very structure of the commission, combined with the loyalty he had cultivated over years, allowed him to maintain authority in a world that, from the outside, appeared chaotic and violent. To observers, it seemed paradoxical. A man confined within concrete walls exerting power over a sprawling criminal network that stretched across the nation. Luciano's ability to govern from prison relied heavily on communication and the strategic use of intermediaries. Trusted lieutenants who had been carefully tested for loyalty and competence, acted as his hands and eyes on the outside. Messages, sometimes coded, sometimes implicit, carried his directives, ensuring that operations continued without interruption. These intermediaries became extensions of Luciano's own will, translating his vision into action and maintaining the delicate balance of alliances that he had meticulously established. In this way, his imprisonment did not dissolve his authority but rather highlighted the sophistication of the organizational systems he had put in place. The psychological dimension of power in prison also played a critical role. Luciano understood that perception was as important as reality. The myth of his control had to be maintained to prevent challenges from within his ranks. Even as other mobsters speculated about his vulnerability, his calculated demeanor, careful communications, and reputation for decisiveness ensured that any attempt to undermine him would be met with resistance. Fear, respect, and strategic loyalty remained intertwined, demonstrating that the structures he had built were resilient to the pressures of absence, incarceration, and scrutiny. Men followed his guidance not only because they feared the consequences of disobedience, but because they recognized the intelligence and foresight behind his decisions. During this period, Luciano also adapted his strategies to the unique environment of prison. He understood that he could leverage his position to gain concessions, influence officials, and even manipulate rival factions. By presenting himself as a disciplined, cooperative inmate while subtly maintaining connections with the outside world, he secured privileges and relative freedom of movement within the institution. These advantages were not merely for comfort. They allowed him to continue observing, directing, and refining the operations of his empire. Even in confinement, he remained a node at the center of a vast network, proving that leadership could transcend physical boundaries when built upon loyalty, organization, and psychological insight. Luciano's continued control from prison also highlighted the importance of his organizational philosophy. He had designed his network to function autonomously in many respects, with delegation, accountability, and clearly defined roles. This meant that even if he were temporarily incapacitated, the system would remain operational. However, his direct involvement ensured that critical decisions, sensitive negotiations, and strategic initiatives still bore his influence. This combination of autonomy and centralized oversight allowed him to mitigate the risks of incarceration, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of operational management rarely seen in criminal enterprises. Moreover, Luciano's time behind bars was not a period of stagnation but one of strategic preparation. He observed the shifting dynamics of the underworld, monitored emerging threats, and evaluated the performance of his lieutenants. Decisions made in prison had long-term implications. Promotions, demotions, assignments, and alliances were all calibrated to strengthen the organization and preserve his authority. He anticipated challenges and positioned loyal actors to maintain stability, ensuring that the outside world would continue to operate under his vision. In essence, prison became a command center, a vantage point from which he could survey the landscape of organized crime and make decisive moves despite physical confinement. The influence Luciano wielded during imprisonment also extended into political and law enforcement spheres. He leveraged relationships that had been nurtured over years, securing preferential treatment, access to information, and protection for his associates. This network of influence underscored the depth of his strategic foresight. He had not only built a criminal empire, but a system that could withstand governmental pressure, legal scrutiny, and the absence of its central figure. The interlocking structures of loyalty, influence, and operational control ensured that he remained a dominant force even as authorities sought to contain him. Yet, the period behind bars was not without tension. Luciano faced constant challenges from rival factions, ambitious lieutenants, and law enforcement efforts aimed at dismantling his influence. Each day required careful attention, subtle maneuvering, and psychological acuity. Decisions that would have been straightforward in the past now required negotiation, timing, and careful orchestration. Every misstep could embolden rivals or alert authorities to vulnerabilities. Luciano's success in maintaining control from prison, therefore, was as much a testament to his intelligence and foresight as it was to the structural design of the organization he had built. Importantly, his ability to operate from confinement reinforced his reputation and the mythos surrounding him. Stories of Luciano directing operations from a cell, influencing outcomes across multiple states, and maintaining unwavering loyalty among his associates only enhanced his aura of invincibility. This perception strengthened the psychological bonds between him and his network, as men were reminded that authority, skill, and strategy could transcend the limitations of physical presence. Fear, respect, and loyalty remained potent tools, carefully calibrated to maintain stability and order. Through this period, Luciano demonstrated that leadership is not solely about physical presence but about vision, strategy, and the cultivation of loyalty. The empire he had built was resilient not because of intimidation alone, but because it was engineered to function under pressure, anticipate threats, and adapt to changing circumstances. His continued influence from prison illustrated a central truth of his career. Power, when combined with foresight, psychological insight, and organizational discipline, could endure even when the leader was physically constrained. Ultimately, Luciano's control behind bars reaffirmed the durability of the systems he had designed. While imprisonment was intended to diminish his authority, it became instead a stage to demonstrate the sophistication of his empire. Through careful delegation, psychological manipulation, strategic alliances, and unwavering oversight, he maintained operational control, influenced the underworld, and continued to shape the trajectory of organized crime. Even confined, he remained not just a figurehead but a commanding force, proving that the true essence of power lies not in mobility or presence, but in vision, loyalty, and the meticulous orchestration of a complex, human network. Following his conviction and imprisonment, Lucky Luciano's trajectory took an unexpected turn that would redefine the later chapters of his life. While incarceration was intended to neutralize his influence, it ultimately set the stage for both exile and reinvention. By the early 1940s, the world had shifted dramatically. World War II had engulfed Europe, the United States had entered the conflict, and the country faced pressing concerns about national security. In this context, Luciano's reputation for organization, intelligence, and influence, qualities that had once been weapons in his criminal arsenal, became an asset in the eyes of government authorities. It was a paradoxical situation. A man whose life had been devoted to subverting law now found himself courted for collaboration in a matter of national importance. The United States Navy and federal agencies were increasingly concerned about potential sabotage along the eastern seaboard and the strategic ports of New York and New Jersey. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, threatening shipping lanes critical to the war effort. The docks, long a hub of organized crime activity, were vulnerable points that could be exploited by enemy agents or used to disrupt supplies. It was here that Luciano's deep connections within the labor unions, dockworkers, and criminal networks became unexpectedly valuable. Authorities realized that negotiating with the man who controlled these networks could significantly enhance port security, reduce the risk of sabotage, and ensure smooth logistics for the war effort. The government's pragmatic approach marked a turning point. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano could potentially gain leverage over his sentence and establish the conditions for a new chapter in life. Luciano's response to this offer reflected the strategic mind that had guided his entire career. Recognizing both the opportunity and the risk, he agreed to assist the government, carefully calibrating his involvement to maximize benefit while minimizing exposure. Through intermediaries and trusted associates, he coordinated efforts to secure the docks, prevent strikes, and reduce opportunities for sabotage. His work demonstrated a remarkable ability to translate criminal organizational skills into a tool of national strategy, a skill set that authorities reluctantly acknowledged as invaluable. The collaboration blurred the boundaries between legality and criminality, showing how deeply his influence permeated society and illustrating his adaptability to shifting circumstances. Despite the temporary reprieve, the government's arrangement with Luciano came with conditions. His sentence remained a looming threat, and political pressures ensured that his freedom was not guaranteed indefinitely. By the end of the war, authorities decided to deport him to Italy, effectively removing him from the United States while simultaneously eliminating the potential risk of continued criminal activity on American soil. The deportation marked the beginning of his exile, a period of life characterized by both limitation and reinvention. For a man who had spent decades orchestrating power with surgical precision, this enforced relocation demanded a recalibration of strategy, ambition, and identity. Luciano's life in Italy presented both challenges and opportunities. Removed from the direct operational control of the American underworld, he nevertheless maintained influence through correspondence, intermediaries, and careful cultivation of loyal allies. His understanding of organizational psychology, loyalty, and strategic planning allowed him to continue shaping the operations of his former empire from abroad. At the same time, he had to navigate a new cultural and political environment, adjusting to post-war Italy while protecting his personal security and reputation. Exile tested his resilience, forcing him to balance ambition with pragmatism, visibility with discretion, and influence with distance. During this period, Luciano also underwent a philosophical and personal transformation. The years of imprisonment and exile provided a context for reflection, an opportunity to assess the trajectory of his life, the consequences of his actions, and the legacy of his empire. He observed the continued evolution of organized crime in the United States, noting the successes and failures of those who operated without his direct oversight. This distance reinforced the understanding that power was as much about foresight, relationships, and psychological influence as it was about immediate action. Luciano's capacity to accept limitation while continuing to exert influence reflected a maturation of strategy, recognizing that leadership often extends beyond proximity and control. Exile also offered moments of personal introspection. Removed from the constant pressures of American underworld politics, Luciano could consider the human costs of his ambitions, the lives lost in gang wars, the betrayals endured, and the moral compromises necessary to maintain dominance. While he did not abandon his fundamental identity as a strategist and operator, These years forced a confrontation with the consequences of the empire he had built. This period revealed a complex man, both pragmatic and reflective, ruthless and perceptive, a figure whose intellect had enabled enormous achievement and whose decisions had profound consequences for countless lives. Despite the distance and the limitations of exile, Luciano's legacy continued to assert itself. His former associates implemented his strategies, maintained the commission, and adapted his vision of organized crime to the changing social and economic landscape. Even in Italy, Luciano remained a figure of authority, influence, and cautionary respect. His exile was not the end of his impact but a new phase in which the systems he had built were tested without his immediate oversight. This demonstrated the durability of his organizational philosophy. Loyalty, strategic planning, and psychological acuity could extend influence far beyond the physical presence of the leader. The exile years also highlighted Luciano's adaptability. While stripped of direct operational control, he found ways to engage selectively with networks of influence, balancing discretion with strategic communication. He learned to operate within new political and social constraints, to navigate uncertainty, and to maintain relevance in a world where power was increasingly decentralized. In doing so, he continued to exert influence over both criminal and legitimate spheres, demonstrating a remarkable capacity to adjust strategies in response to changing circumstances, a hallmark of the intelligence and foresight that had defined his career. Ultimately, Luciano's exile and the endgame of his public life illustrated a broader lesson in strategy, resilience, and human adaptability. He had risen from street-level operations to the apex of organized crime, survived internal war and legal prosecution, and even from prison and exile maintained influence that reshaped the underworld. His later years, while constrained geographically and politically, confirmed the enduring impact of his vision, that systems, loyalty, and psychological insight could outlast physical control, and that a leader's influence could extend across time, space, and circumstance. Exile was both a limitation and a testament, a final chapter in which the genius of Luciano's organizational mind remained unmistakably evident, shaping the criminal world long after his personal presence had been removed from it. Lucky Luciano transformed organized crime from chaotic street gangs into a sophisticated, nationally coordinated enterprise. His creation of the commission institutionalized cooperation among rival families, reducing internal violence and enhancing strategic efficiency. Beyond structure, Luciano's genius lay in understanding human psychology, blending fear, respect, and incentive to secure loyalty and manage ambition. He professionalized illegal enterprises from gambling to labor rackets, operating them with corporate-like strategy and foresight. Even from prison and later exile, his influence endured through trusted lieutenants, demonstrating the durability of the systems he built. Luciano's innovations set the template for modern organized crime, showing that power could be maintained through structure, strategy, and psychological insight rather than brute force alone. His legacy is both operational and symbolic, a blueprint for leadership in illicit networks, and a cautionary example of ambition, influence, and the human cost of unbridled power. Lucky Luciano's life is a study in power, ambition, and the paradox of myth versus reality. Rising from street-level chaos to command a national criminal empire, he mastered strategy, loyalty, and psychological influence. Yet his brilliance came with personal cost: imprisonment, exile, and moral compromises that affected countless lives. The legend celebrates his ingenuity, while the reality reveals a man navigating perilous alliances, law enforcement pressure, and the fragility of human loyalty. Luciano's story illustrates that true influence relies not only on immediate control but on the ability to embed strategy and foresight into resilient systems that endure beyond one's presence. It also serves as a cautionary tale about ambition, consequence, and ethical compromise. Ultimately, Luciano's narrative captivates because it intertwines intellect with ruthlessness, order with chaos, and personal vision with systemic impact, leaving a complex legacy that continues to shape organized crime and the understanding of human leadership in extreme circumstances.